Hello, my name's Tom and welcome back to my channel where I talk a little bit about theatre, a little bit about being a PhD student, and a little bit about those two things forced to live together in a slightly too small two-bedroom flat. No long-winded introduction from me today other than to say we're going to continue our wading through some key terms in cultural theory by looking at modernism. Also, I have just got back from holiday and that is why I have a slightly sunburnt nose. Particularly today we're going to be really interested in how this use of the word modernism relates to the discussions about art and culture and society and politics more generally. If you have any thoughts or questions along the way, then do make sure to let me know down in the comments, and as always, if you think this thing might be vaguely useful, then do consider lending me one of your subscribes. Without further ado though, here is Modernism, What the Theory? Colloquially, the term modern is something which travels with us as the years tick by. Take cars for example, something I know next to nothing about. What was considered to be a modern car in the 1920s is very different to what was considered to be a modern car in the 1940s, and the 1960s, and the 1980s, and the 2000s, and today. When used in this regard, we might consider the word modern to have a lot in common with the word contemporary, meaning something of the period in which we are speaking. Yet even this use of the word modern is not completely objective. So, someone with a brand new 2018 Audi A1, which Google tells me is a thing, might consider themselves to have a far more modern car than someone who drives a 2010 Suzuki Swift, despite the fact that both are functioning completely fine within the year 2018. In this case, we can see that the term modern actually becomes a subjective opinion or a value judgment. As we continue our discussion of modernism throughout this video, both these definitions are worth keeping in the back of your mind. When we use the word modern, we might totally earnestly be using it to describe something that is simply recent or new or contemporary. However, when doing so, we often subconsciously also invoke the idea that what is new or recent is fundamentally better than what is older. The term modernism, then, is not used to describe works of art that are being created now in the year 2018, or whatever year you're watching this in, depending on how long YouTube lasts. Instead, it's used to describe a specific period in art history, and I'm using the word art incredibly broadly there to mean all different forms of art, from roughly the end of the 19th century to about the middle of the 20th century. Some people might describe modernism as an artistic movement. However, I'd say it's more accurate to describe it as a collection of movements. For while there hasn't been a single artistic movement in history where everyone involved in it is in total agreement about everything, there is usually a considerable similarity between the artistic styles, or what we call aesthetic styles, between all of the artists that are creating work as part of that movement. Among the many artists that we might associate with modernism or consider to be modernists, however, there is a huge deviation in both the form and content of their work. Let's begin by taking an example from visual art. So, Monet's Water Lilies and Picasso's Guernica are both widely considered to be examples of modernist art. Their styles, however, are incredibly different. The reason for this is that Monet considered himself to be an impressionist, while Picasso was perhaps the artist who defined the Cubism movement. The Impressionists saw a new way to capture nature within art. They therefore did away with the process of sketching while outdoors and then taking those sketches indoors to complete a painting based on that sketch, in favour of taking all their oils and artistic materials out with them to paint in situ. They were really interested in, rather than catching nature as it appears to the human eye, capturing the ever-changing colours and light that happens within nature. The Cubists, on the other hand, had very little interest in capturing things as they appeared to humans in the moment. Instead, they were really interested in capturing the totality of the object of their artwork. They did this mostly through taking how it looked through multiple different viewpoints and placing those together on a single piece of paper. The resultant pieces of art made by the Impressionists and the Cubists are vastly different. In fact, their artistic styles and motivations don't even directly contradict each other, and therefore seem like they might have absolutely nothing in common. Why then do we discuss both in terms of being forms of modernism? Perhaps it's best to consider modernism then, not as a particular collection of thoughts, in the way that we might be able to describe Impressionism or Cubism as a particular collection of thoughts, but instead as a way of thinking. Both Monet and Picasso rejected the artistic forms and ideas which came before them. In the pre-modern era, most pre-modern artistic movements considered themselves to be doing art in service of God, and therefore they were far more interested in how they could capture their inspiration on the page, rather than being interested in artistic form for the sake of the artistic form's sake. Both the Impressionists and the Cubists, however, are very interested in privileging artistic technique when they're discussing their ideas, with very little thought for divine inspiration. What modernist movements have in common then is first a rejection of the past. What they also have in common, however, is the idea that they can make art objectively better, and this is true across art forms. Prior to this period, visual art was often created in service of a deity. Literature was often, I would argue, created in order to document history or particular lifestyles as they happened, while theatre and performance were primarily used, particularly in the English context, in service of a king or queen and their ancestors. As such, the aesthetic style or form that these artworks took was never in the spotlight. Certainly, particular styles came and went from fashion, however these were always viewed as kind of side products of those broader functions. When we look at modernist movements then, we begin to see artists become interested in the practice of art itself and in discussing and exploring the form that it might take. Also, and this will particularly come in useful when we want to distinguish between modernist movements and postmodernist movements, all of these artists across forms believed that they could make art objectively better. If a sculptor or filmmaker or musician today were to suggest that they had figured out a way to make their art form reflect the world around them better in an objective manner, we'd perhaps treat them with a little bit of suspicion or consider them a little bit arrogant. When we're discussing the modernists, however, we're discussing groups of people who are living at a time where it was very possible for them to very earnestly and honestly make those statements with the true belief that they were working towards a better realisation of the world through art. While the developments that occurred during the modernist era can often seem unrelated and, between particular different art forms, can sometimes seem entirely contradictory, what we do see that unites modernism across all the different art forms and movements is a particular way of thinking. It is a period of explosive formal experiment, and in particular we can see this in the forest loads of manifestos that were published announcing each of the particular artistic movements throughout this period. And in mentioning manifestos, it's perhaps worth turning briefly to politics, where we can see a similar thing happening, which might help to synthesize this idea of modernism as a way of thinking. If the modern period was that in which the isms dominated within art, they also dominated within politics. Again, there had certainly been disagreements in how to best run a country or a continent or the world in the past. However, it's in this period, from about the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 20th century, that we begin to see some of our more modern or contemporary political ideologies develop. We gain socialism, capitalism gets its name, and fascism takes hold in Europe. Unlike previous political ideologies, which may have seen themselves as just one idea among many, each of these sees themselves as the defining political ideology which can take humanity to the best place, to some kind of utopia. When we talk about modernism then, we're not talking about a particular movement, but a whole array of a movement, from impressionism and cubism in art, to futurism and naturalism in performance, to anarchism and socialism in politics. It's really a period of history in which the way we think about society and the world, and therefore culture and art, is operating in a particular way. And although many of these artistic movements consider themselves to be breaking with the past and therefore pushing forward human progress, in doing so they also fall into the trap that we discussed at the beginning of this video, of assuming their objective critique of things which are modern to be fundamentally better than those which have gone before. They don't engage critically with this concept and assume it to be a value judgment, but embrace it as an objective fact. And, as we'll find out when we move on to postmodernism in my next video, this was something that was to become very much questioned after the world was witness to 2 world wars in very quick succession. But, as I say, that's something that we'll look at next time. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it's been a bit of a start at trying to crack that quite difficult to crack nut of modernism. I've got some really exciting What the Theory videos planned for the future, but as always, do let me know down below if you've got any particular concepts that you're struggling with that you think would make for a good video. And also, if you have enjoyed this one, then please do consider lending it one of your thumbs ups. Thank you very much for watching once again. That's all from me, and have a great week.